What is it they say about history? It's that series of difficult and terrifying events that folks have to go through only to be written down and 100 years later put somebody to sleep in their chair at night, right? If you were with us for the last couple of segments, you remember that first we were looking at the connections to the past. And we talked about Fred Reed and his grandfather having shaken Abraham Lincoln's hand. And just, Fred shook his grandfather's hand. I shook Fred's hand. By the way, Paul also shook Fred's hand. and that the degrees of separation are actually closer than we often think. And then we talked about, in the second segment, just how different Thomas Green's world was from ours, how he got sick and he had no resources, and it was days, and he was going to die. After that, in the third segment, we talked about Henry Dunster, the first president of Harvard College, who was actually run out of his office because he had Baptistic tendencies. He believed in the Bible, and he believed, as we do, in believers' baptism. Now I want to look at the influence of the Baptist Church and the early Baptists on the very liberties we hold in our present society. So we're going to go back to music for a bit. I want you to complete this phrase. Love and marriage, love and marriage. Go together like a horse and carriage. You got it. Isn't that wonderful, huh? Now, if I told you religion and politics have the same connection, what would you say? Ooh, right? Right, but what's the saying? There are two things you do not discuss in polite company: religion and politics. That's right. That's right. And why is that? Because both get people really upset at times, and both oftentimes are in great conflict with one another. And if you're a student of human history, you realize that the ultimate questions, the questions of who are we? Why are we here? Who's in charge? Really are answered only by religion, and then secondarily by politics. Politics, how do we order our affairs? Who's in charge, or who's temporarily in charge? So politics and religion are never easily separated. Now, we talked about the early Baptists and how they were persecuted for their beliefs. We talked about them and the Quakers and the various things they had to go through, the stocks and the shackles and all that. And you may be familiar with this phrase, the separation of church and state. Everybody hear that? What most people don't realize is, now that was a statement, everybody thinks it's in the Constitution. No, it's not in the Constitution. Never was, never will be. Okay? However, it was in a letter from Thomas Jefferson while he was president to a Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut. And their concern was, is this new federal government, which was by then only, maybe 8 years old, going to trample on our religious beliefs? Now remember, for 150 some odd years prior to that, all the governments had been doing just that, okay? Many of the state governments, or the colonial governments, prior to the Revolution, had state churches. In fact, state churches were common among the states even up to, say, the 1840s. I think the state church in Massachusetts hung on till around that time, but don't quote me, I could be wrong. So I went back and I looked at the records just to see if I could find what influence this church might have had on the Revolution, or what was the mind of this church during the Revolution. Because obviously, while we did talk about that Leicester seemed to be a safe haven for the Baptists, still the prevailing thought in Massachusetts and elsewhere in the colonies was very, very different. I really could not find a lot, other than if you go to the town common where we hold the Fun Fest, and all the festivities are up towards the bandstand, but if you take a walk around the perimeter, you're going to see two stones. One is a monument to the Minutemen, and the other is a small stone that looks a lot like the little slate tablets down here in the cemetery. It's dedicated to the descendants of Thomas Green. Now, not our Thomas Green. It's dedicated to the descendants of his grandfather. So it included his son Samuel, who was a first selectman in Leicester, his son Thomas, who was the first pastor of this church, and a whole bunch of other Greens that were living at the time. And it says this. It says, dedicated to the Green family. At the very bottom, through the moss, you can read, they tilled these fields, healed the sick, preached the gospel, and fought for their country. Let's go back to this idea that history is these terrifying events that put people to sleep a century later. In the Revolution, people had to take sides. And for the Baptists, taking sides was particularly difficult because they lived among people who were very happy to trample them down and to tell them that their faith was nothing more than, they didn't belong to a church, they belonged to a society, as this church was founded. So they've got this crisis of conscience. In the Revolution, everybody had a crisis of conscience. You had to pick your sides, and if the colonial folks lost, if George Washington's army had been defeated, there would have been serious repercussions, loss of liberty, property, life. For the same thing, the Loyalists, Tories as they were called, their story is largely untold because they did not win. But many of them got packed off to Great Britain or voluntarily left. Right? There are consequences. You take sides, you pick the right side, you win. You pick the wrong side, you lose. So the Baptists had this dilemma. Here they are among colonies where they have been persecuted, maybe with the exception of Rhode Island, because they all escaped, all those good Baptists down there, and we can talk about that at some other point. But which side do they pick? Well, they eventually decided that they'd better throw their lot with their countrymen, the colonies, because the State Church of England was Anglican, and as late as 1774, the Anglicans were persecuting Baptists in Virginia. They would send out the sheriffs to arrest them, oftentimes in the accompaniment of the local minister, simply to go after the Baptist preacher for preaching without a license or disturbing the public peace. In fact, there was one guy, James Ireland, who was preaching from the bars of his jail cell, and they ran horsemen through the crowd that was listening to him with clubs and with whips to disperse the crowd. So the Baptists said, okay, Anglicans, countrymen, I think we'll do the countryman thing. So let's fast forward. The revolution takes place. Washington defeats Cornwallis. Now it's time we have to set up a government. And again, the problem with government is you need a government that's strong enough to do what has to be done, and yet not so strong that it will take away all our liberties, that it will do what the folks did to the Baptists, all right? In the Declaration of Independence, we read that governments are instituted among men to secure rights and liberties. First and foremost, not so much to keep the streetcars running and the electricity on and the lights on and the roads clear, but to secure rights and liberties. So this idea of rights and liberties all of a sudden comes rushing up to the forefront. And the country forms what are called the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation were a relatively weak form of government. Remember Washington freezing with his troops in Valley Forge? Well, he was essentially operating under a de facto Articles of Confederation. They had been put forth but not adopted completely during the war. They were adopted completely later, but it basically boiled down to the federal government, the national government, had no power really to do anything. They could try to tax the states, but if the states didn't pony up the money, Washington and his men froze and starved. Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop, and now we go and finally decide as a nation, we've got to come up with something a little bit better than this. So around 1787, delegates are sent to Philadelphia to come up with a new plan, a new government called the Constitution. Now their task is to make a government that is strong enough to do what's got to be done, but again, this idea that it secures rights and liberties. You know, you watch TV, and the cop collars the criminal, and the criminal says, I know my rights. Okay. So they set out to make this government, this new government of checks and balances, where there's a legislature and a judiciary and an executive, the president, and they're all separate and theoretically co-equal. Therefore, they all kind of hedge one another in. But it became very quickly apparent that this was not going to succeed in being ratified or adopted by the states, that it would not take hold without this idea of a Bill of Rights. So as the Constitution is put out to the states, it is put out with already amendments. You ever sit through a church business meeting and then I want to amend this, I want to amend that, I want to amend this. Well, that's essentially what happened. And the amendments, the first 10 amendments, are what we now call the Bill of Rights. So let's go to that just a second. In fact, we're not going to go through all the Bill of Rights. We're going to deal with just one, the First Amendment. In fact, we're not even going to address the whole First Amendment. We're going to address the first clause. I thought it was the first sentence, but it's all one sentence. But the first clause says this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Thomas Jefferson was largely credited with all the words of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created, there you go, by their Creator equal, right? James Madison was a young man from Virginia who would go on to serve as president. James Madison is widely regarded as one of the prime architects of the Constitution. Now, James Madison, as a young man, was greatly influenced by the persecution he saw of the Baptist Church in Virginia. Remember that incident we just talked about where the clergy, the Anglican clergy, was in cahoots with the sheriff going after the Baptist preachers? Madison looked at that and he reviled it. He said this: that diabolical, hell-conceived principle of persecution rages among some, and to their internal infamy, the clergy can furnish their quota of imps for such business. Other than that, he had no strong opinions. Now, Madison was no Baptist, okay? In fact, he also said this when talking about the Baptists. He says, their enthusiasm, which contributed to render them obnoxious to sober opinion. So he didn't like them particularly, but he really, really did not like what was happening to them. And he also said religious bondage shackles and debilitates the mind and unfits it for every noble enterprise, every expanded prospect. So here is a man who was affected by the history of Baptist persecution. Now, that persecution had gone on for some 140 years before the Revolution. 140 years previous to the Revolution, Roger Williams was saying, no, there's got to be a separation, a wall of separation between church and state. Not that the church can't point its finger at the state and say, you're wrong and you're doing this wrong, because that's what's commonly held to be today. But it's that the state has no claim on the conscience of man and his relationship or her relationship with their God. So, once again, we see a line of connectedness being drawn. We don't think that when we're going through hard times, that when we're going through persecution, that people take notice. You don't think as you sit in the pews or you talk to somebody that your conversation or your life isn't being taken notice of. It's not necessarily true. Those Baptists of 140 years prior to the Revolution, up into 1774, those Baptists that were outside of that guy's jail cell that had the horses run through them, you know, what were they thinking? That was a defeat for them. Somebody takes notice. History is not always in your hands, but your conduct, my conduct, will serve God's purposes. The guarantee to hold a free conscience about God, our relationship to Him, is and must be held sacred, secure, and separate from the civil order. This is the takeaway from their persecution. That's the line. That's how things are connected. And that is His story. That is our story.